The rain hammered against the grimy windows of Murphy's diner like bullets against armor plating. Marcus Chun sat hunched over his third cup of coffee, watching the neon lights of New Angeles blur into watercolor streaks through the glass. His cybernetic left arm whirred softly as he lifted the cup, the servo motors protesting after 12 years without proper maintenance. The VA had stopped covering repairs for obsolete military hardware 6 months ago. Outside, the city's towering spires disappeared into the perpetual smog that had settled over Earth's megacities since the Galactic trade wars ended. Flying cars zipped through designated air lanes, their engines creating a constant drone that most humans had learned to tune out. Marcus hadn't. Military conditioning was hard to break, even 5 years after his discharge from the Terran Defense Corps. "Another coffee, hon?" Dolores, the diner's owner, held up the pot with a weary smile. Her husband had been Kia at Proxima Station, and she'd been running this place alone ever since, serving cheap food to veterans, dock workers, and anyone else the galaxy's economic boom had left behind. "Thanks, but I should head out." Marcus placed a few credit chips on the counter, enough to cover his meal and a decent tip. His disability pension wasn't much, but Dolores needed it more than he did. The automatic door hissed open as he stepped into the rain. The acidic precipitation stung his exposed skin, another lovely side effect of atmosphere processors working overtime to support 40 billion humans crammed onto one planet. His worn combat boots splashed through puddles that reflected the garish advertisements holographically projected onto every available surface. Premium vegan protein, grown in zero-G for maximum efficiency. Join the Colonial Marines. See the galaxy. New Horizons awaits. Apply for off-world relocation today. Marcus ignored them all. He'd seen enough of the galaxy during his 20-year career, from the frozen hell of Titan to the radioactive wastelands of Kepler 442b. Earth might be crowded and polluted, but at least nobody was shooting at him. His apartment was a 30-minute walk through the lower district, where the buildings were older and the air recycling system struggled to keep up with demand. Street vendors hawked everything from synthetic meat to black market medical supplies, their stalls crowded under makeshift awnings. Alien refugees from the outer colonies mixed with human civilians, creating a polyglot cacophony that rose and fell with the rhythm of urban life. Marcus had just turned onto Meridian Street when he heard it, a sound that made every combat instinct he possessed snap to attention. It was barely audible over the rain and traffic, but unmistakable to anyone who'd served in the Outer Rim campaigns. Dragon Song. The low, thrumming vocalization carried emotional undertones that human ears weren't designed to fully comprehend, but the universal translator implant behind Marcus's left ear parsed it into something his brain could process. Desperation, fear, hunger, and underneath it all, a protective fury that spoke of maternal instinct pushed to its breaking point. Marcus followed the sound down a narrow alley between two residential towers, his enhanced vision automatically adjusting for the reduced light. The buildings rose 60 stories above him, their upper levels disappearing into the perpetual cloud cover. Here, in the canyon between them, the rain formed a steady waterfall from overloaded drainage systems. He found them huddled beneath a broken fire escape, partially sheltered by a tattered piece of thermal sheeting. The mother was enormous by human standards, nearly 3 meters long, not counting her tail, with scales that might have been beautiful if they weren't dulled by malnutrition and stress. Her wings, designed for the low gravity and thin atmosphere of her homeworld, hung limply at her sides, useless in Earth's heavy environment. But it was the child that made Marcus's heart clench with familiar pain. The young dragon was barely larger than a house cat, its scales a pale imitation of its mother's deep emerald color. It lay still against her side, breathing in shallow, rapid pants that Marcus recognized from too many medevac situations. Starvation. The kid was dying. The mother's head snapped up as Marcus approached, her neck frill flaring in warning. Her translator implant crackled with interference, but her voice came through clearly enough. "Stay back, human. I have nothing left to steal. Marcus stopped 10 feet away, his hands visible and empty. I'm not here to steal anything. I heard you singing. Her golden eyes narrowed, and it sounded like a mother asking for help. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the rain-soaked alley. Marcus had encountered Draconis refugees before during his military service, mostly fleeing the ecological collapse that had followed the hegemony's strip mining operations on their homeworld. They were proud people with a cultural structure that valued honor and family bonds above individual survival. For one to beg, even in song, meant they had reached the absolute end of their options. "My name is Marcus Chun," he said, slowly reaching into his jacket. The mother tensed, but relaxed slightly when he pulled out his veteran's identification card. "Terran Defense Corps, retired. I fought alongside your people at Rigel Prime." Recognition flickered in her eyes. The Battle of Rigel Prime had been one of the few instances where Terran and Draconis forces had cooperated against the hegemony's expansion. It had ended badly for everyone involved, but there had been mutual respect between the species' warriors. "Sirith," she replied after a moment. "Former wing commander of the Jade Talon Squadron. This is my daughter, Keth." The formal introduction was a sign of trust, however tentative. Marcus nodded respectfully and took a careful step closer. "What happened to bring you here, wing commander?" Siritha's laugh was bitter and tinged with the harmonic frequencies of despair. "The same thing that happened to all my people who couldn't afford passage off Earth when the economy collapsed. We were trapped." She gestured with one clawed hand at the alley around them. "The refugee shelters are full. The food distribution centers ran out of Draconis-compatible nutrition 3 weeks ago. I've been trying to find work, but who wants to hire a former military pilot with obsolete training?" Marcus knew that frustration intimately. The galaxy's economy had shifted rapidly after the war's end, leaving millions of veterans from all species struggling to find their place in a universe that suddenly had no need for their skills. But for refugees like Sirith, the situation was even worse. Humans had the advantage of being on their own planet. Displaced Draconis had nowhere to go. "When did Keth last eat?" he asked, noting how the young dragon's ribs were visible beneath her pale scales. 6 days ago. I found some discarded protein bars behind a restaurant, but they made her sick. Terran food isn't." Siritha's voice trailed off, and Marcus could see her fighting back tears. "I've sold everything I owned. My flight medals, my service weapon, even my grandmother's ceremonial armor. It wasn't enough." The rain continued to fall, and Marcus found himself remembering another time, another place, when he'd held a dying child in his arms while her mother begged for medical supplies that weren't coming. That had been during the siege of New Byzantium, and he'd been powerless to help. But this was different. This was Earth, and he wasn't a soldier following orders anymore. "There's a place about 6 blocks from here," he said, pulling up a map on his wrist display. "Murphy's Diner. The owner is good people, and she knows how to cook for non-humans. Let me buy you both a meal." Siritha's pride warred visibly with desperation. "I cannot pay you back. I'm not asking you to." Marcus stepped closer, offering his hand to help Keth to her feet. The young dragon was lighter than she should have been, and her scales felt cold despite her species' naturally high body temperature. Sometimes people help each other because it's the right thing to do. No strings attached. The mother dragon studied his face for a long moment, searching for deception or hidden motives. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she carefully lifted her daughter and nodded. "Very well. But this is a debt of honor, Marcus Chun. I will remember." The walk back to Murphy's Diner took longer than expected. Keth was too weak to fly even short distances, and Sirith had to carry her daughter while navigating the crowded sidewalks. Marcus found himself unconsciously taking point, his body language and bearing causing other pedestrians to give them space. Old habits from convoy escort duty died hard. Several humans stared as they passed, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed hostility. The dragon refugees had been a source of controversy since they'd arrived on Earth, with politicians arguing about resource allocation and cultural integration. Marcus had watched the debates on the news feeds and been disgusted by the casual xenophobia on display. These were people who had lost everything, not an invading army. "The rain feels wrong," Sirith commented as they walked, her translator struggling with some of the cultural concepts she was trying to express. "On my homeworld, rain was a blessing. It brought new growth, new life. Here it tastes of metal and sorrow." "Industrial pollution," Marcus explained. "The atmospheric processors work around the clock, but they can't keep up with the demand from 40 billion people. It's been getting worse every year. And yet humans stay." Sirith adjusted her grip on Keth, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep. "Why do you not spread to other worlds?" It was a fair question, and one that Marcus had pondered himself during his service years. "Some do. The colonial programs are always recruiting, but most people can't afford the transit fees, and the megacorporations prefer to import workers rather than relocate existing populations. It's cheaper that way." So Earth becomes a prison. Marcus couldn't argue with that assessment. The planet that had once been humanity's shining jewel had become overcrowded and polluted, its resources strip-mined to fuel the expansion of human civilization across the galaxy. Those who remained were often those who couldn't afford to leave, trapped in an endless cycle of economic servitude. Murphy's diner appeared ahead of them, its warm yellow lights a beacon in the gray evening. Marcus could see Dolores through the window, wiping down tables as the dinner crowd began to thin out. He hoped she wouldn't mind him bringing in non-human customers. The city had anti-discrimination laws, but social pressure was harder to legislate away. The door chimed as they entered, and conversations at several tables died away as patrons noticed Sirith and her daughter. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, ready to respond to any hostile comments, but the other customers seemed content to stare and whisper among themselves. "Marcus!" Dolores approached them, her expression carefully neutral. "Everything all right?" "These are friends of mine," he said, hoping his tone conveyed that he wouldn't tolerate any problems. "Sirith and her daughter Keth. They're hungry, and I was hoping you could help with that." Dolores studied the two dragons for a moment, then nodded toward a corner booth that would give them some privacy. "Of course. Right this way." As they settled into the booth, Sirith had to curl her tail carefully to fit in the human-sized space. Marcus caught Dolores' arm. "Do you have anything that's safe for Draconis physiology? The kid's been without food for almost a week." Dolores' expression immediately softened with maternal concern. "Oh, honey, let me check what I've got in the back. I think I might have some synthetic proteins that'll work." She bustled away, leaving Marcus alone with Sirith and the sleeping Keth. The mother dragon was staring out the window at the rain, her golden eyes reflecting a depth of sadness that transcended species barriers. "You have children, Marcus Chun?" she asked without looking at him. The question hit harder than he'd expected. "No, never had the chance." He paused, then added, "My partner died during the war. We talked about kids, but I'm sorry for your loss." Sirith's voice carried harmonics of genuine sympathy. "Keth is all I have left. Her father fell during the defense of our homeworld's capital. He died believing that the Galactic Council would honor their treaties, that help was coming." Marcus had read the after-action reports from the fall of Draconis Prime. The Council's response had been too little, too late, hampered by bureaucratic delays and political considerations. By the time the relief fleet arrived, the planet's ecosystem was beyond saving, and most of the population had been killed or displaced. "I failed her father's memory," Sirith continued, gently stroking her daughter's head. "I promised him I would keep her safe, give her a life worthy of our people's heritage. Instead, I brought her to this place to die slowly in an alley." "You didn't fail anyone." Marcus kept his voice low, but firm. "You survived an impossible situation and got your daughter to safety. That takes courage. Does it? Or does it simply take desperation?" Before Marcus could answer, Dolores returned with a steaming bowl and a concerned expression. "I've got some high-protein broth here with mineral supplements that should be compatible. It's not much, but it should help her get her strength back." The smell of the food roused Keth from her exhausted sleep. Her eyes opened, the same golden color as her mother's, and she lifted her head weakly. "Mama, I smell food." Siritha's entire demeanor changed instantly, maternal instinct overriding her own hunger and exhaustion. She took the bowl from Dolores with a nod of thanks and helped her daughter sit up. "Eat slowly, little star," she murmured, using an endearment that the translator rendered in warm, protective tones. "Your stomach needs time to remember what food is." Marcus watched as Keth managed a few sips of the broth, her pale scales already showing the faintest hint of more vibrant color. It was a small improvement, but it was a start. Dolores had withdrawn to give them privacy, but Marcus could see her keeping a watchful eye on their table. Other customers continued to steal glances, some curious, others disapproving. He found himself cataloging potential threats out of old habit, noting exits, and calculating angles of fire. "This is good," Keth whispered after managing to consume nearly half the bowl. "Thank you." The simple gratitude in her voice, rendered in the musical tones of the Draconis language, cut straight through Marcus's emotional defenses. He'd seen too many children suffer during his military career, too many families torn apart by war and politics and economic necessity. But this time, he could actually do something about it. "Dolores," he called, catching the diner owner's attention. "Could you bring another bowl for Sirith? And maybe some of those protein cakes if you have them." "Marcus, no." Siritha's voice carried undertones of distress. "You have already done too much. I cannot. You're not in a position to argue about this." He kept his tone gentle, but left no room for debate. "Your daughter needs you healthy. Let me help." As Dolores brought more food, Marcus found himself thinking about the choices that had led him to this moment. He could have walked past that alley, pretended not to hear the dragon's song of despair. It would have been easier, safer, more practical. Instead, he'd chosen to get involved, to take responsibility for two strangers who had every reason to distrust humans. It wasn't logical. It wasn't practical. But it felt right in a way that nothing had since his discharge from the service. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the city clean while accomplishing nothing. But inside Murphy's diner, two dragons ate their first real meal in days, and a human veteran remembered what it felt like to make a difference. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems that couldn't be solved with a bowl of soup and good intentions. But tonight, it was enough to know that Keth would wake up alive, and her mother would have the strength to keep fighting for their survival. Sometimes, Marcus thought as he watched the small dragon family eat, the smallest victories were the most important ones. 3 days after their first meeting, Marcus found himself walking the same route to Murphy's diner, but this time with purpose beyond his usual solitary routine. He'd spent the intervening time researching Draconis physiology, employment opportunities for non-human refugees, and the labyrinthine bureaucracy that govern immigration services on Earth. What he'd learned had both frustrated and motivated him in equal measure. The morning air carried the usual cocktail of industrial pollutants and recycled atmosphere, but Marcus barely noticed. His cybernetic arm had developed a new grinding sound in the servo joint, a reminder that he needed to visit a black market mechanic soon. The official repair centers wouldn't touch obsolete military hardware, and the VA's latest cost-cutting measures had eliminated most veteran support services. Murphy's diner was busier than usual when he arrived, the breakfast rush in full swing. Dock workers grabbed quick meals before their shifts, while office employees nursed coffee and checked their data tablets. Marcus scanned the crowd automatically, a habit from his security training that had never quite faded. He found Sirith and Keth at the same corner booth they'd occupied 3 days earlier, though both looked significantly better than when he'd first encountered them. Keth's scales had regained some of their natural luster, and she was sitting upright without assistance. Sirith still carried herself with the careful posture of someone conserving energy, but the desperate edge of starvation had left her eyes. "Marcus," Keth's greeting carried the musical harmonics of genuine happiness. "Look, Mama, Marcus came back." Cirith nodded respectfully as he approached their table. "You honor us with your presence, Marcus-chun. Though I must confess surprise at seeing you again so soon." Marcus slid into the booth across from them, noting that they were sharing a single bowl of the mineral-enriched broth that Dolores had specially prepared. His research had revealed that the diner owner was buying the expensive Draconis-compatible supplements with her own money, a kindness that probably stretched her already tight budget. "I wanted to check on how you were doing," he said, which was true but incomplete. "And I might have some information that could help with your situation." Ciritha's neck frill fluttered slightly, a sign of increased attention that Marcus had learned to recognize. "What sort of information?" Marcus pulled out his data tablet and set it on the table, angling the screen so both dragons could see it. "I've been looking into employment opportunities for refugees with military backgrounds. There aren't many, but there are some options." The tablet displayed a job posting for security consultants at one of the orbital freight terminals. The pay was decent, and the position specifically mentioned that non-human applicants were welcome. Marcus had already submitted an inquiry on Ciritha's behalf, emphasizing her military experience and leadership background. Orbital security? Cirith studied the posting with professional interest. "I have experience with space-based operations, but most of my training was in atmospheric combat. And the physical requirements." She gestured at her wings, which were still folded against her sides. Marcus had learned that Draconis wings were adapted for flight in low-gravity environments with thin atmospheres. Earth's heavy gravity and dense air made flying exhausting and inefficient, effectively grounding a species that had evolved for aerial mobility. The posting mentions that they're specifically looking for someone to train their existing security teams in multi-species threat assessment, Marcus explained. "Your combat experience with different alien species would be valuable. And the work is mostly administrative and instructional, not field operations." Keth looked up from her broth with bright, curious eyes. "Will we have a place to live? A real place?" The question hit Marcus harder than he'd expected. He'd been focused on employment and nutrition, treating their situation as a tactical problem to be solved. But for a young dragon who'd spent weeks living in alleys and shelters, the simple concept of having a permanent home was almost incomprehensible. "The job includes housing allocation points," he said gently. "It's not much, probably a small apartment in one of the worker housing blocks, but it would be yours." Ciritha's emotional control wavered for a moment, allowing Marcus to glimpse the desperate hope she'd been carefully suppressing. And they would truly consider a Draconis applicant? The bureaucracy on this planet seems designed to exclude non-humans from meaningful employment. Marcus couldn't argue with that assessment. His research had revealed a systemic pattern of discrimination that was technically illegal, but practically widespread. Many employers found excuses to reject non-human applicants, citing concerns about equipment compatibility, cultural differences, or simple prejudice dressed up as workplace harmony considerations. "I've already spoken with the hiring manager," he said. "Former Marine Corps colonel named Sarah Rodriguez. I served under her briefly during the Titan campaign. She's straightforward and doesn't have patience for bureaucratic nonsense. If you're qualified for the job, she'll hire you regardless of species." Dolores appeared at their table with a fresh pot of coffee and a maternal smile. "Morning, Marcus. How are my dragon friends doing today?" "Better, thanks to you," Cirith replied formally. "Your kindness has been—" She paused, her translator struggling with a cultural concept that didn't have a direct human equivalent. "You have honored our family with your generosity." "Nonsense." Dolores waved off the thanks with practiced efficiency. "You're paying customers, same as anyone else. Speaking of which, are you ready for some actual food today? I got a shipment of those protein cubes your daughter likes." Marcus watched the interchange with interest. Over the past 3 days, Dolores had gradually introduced more variety into Keth's diet, carefully monitoring her reactions to different foods and adjusting portions based on her recovery progress. It was the kind of attentive care that spoke to deeper compassion, the instinctive protectiveness of a woman who'd lost her own family and found new purpose in helping others. As Dolores bustled away to prepare their order, Marcus turned back to the employment discussion. There's something else you should know about this job. The orbital terminals see a lot of traffic from refugee transports and illegal smuggling operations. Part of the security assessment involves identifying potential threats while distinguishing between actual criminals and desperate families looking for sanctuary. Siritha's eyes sharpened with professional interest. Threat assessment based on behavioral patterns rather than species profiling. Exactly. Someone with your background would understand the difference between a mother fleeing persecution and a smuggler running contraband. That kind of insight is valuable to legitimate security operations. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the diner's entrance. Marcus turned to see three humans in expensive suits arguing loudly with another customer, their voices carrying the entitled aggression of people who are used to getting their way. Told you people that this establishment needs to maintain certain standards. One of them was saying, his gaze pointedly directed toward the corner booth where Sirith and Keth sat. There are plenty of other places that cater to alternative clienteles. Marcus felt his combat instincts activate, adrenaline sharpening his focus as he assessed the potential threat. The three men carried themselves with the soft arrogance of mid-level corporate executives, probably from one of the development companies that were trying to gentrify the lower district. Their suits were too expensive for the neighborhood, and their attitudes suggested they were used to intimidating people who couldn't fight back. "Excuse me." Marcus stood up, his movement fluid and controlled. "Is there a problem here?" The lead spokesman turned toward him with a practiced sneer. "No problem that concerns you, friend. We're just having a discussion about appropriate business practices with the management." Dolores emerged from behind the counter, her expression hard. "There's no discussion here. I've told you gentlemen before that all paying customers are welcome in my establishment. If you don't like it, you're free to eat somewhere else." "That's exactly what we're trying to tell you," the second man interjected. "Your current policies are affecting the neighborhood's development potential. Certain investors are concerned about property values when businesses cater to undesirable elements." Marcus had heard variations of this conversation before, usually as a prelude to violence. He stepped closer to the group, his posture shifting into something that anyone with military experience would recognize as a threat display. "Define undesirable elements for me," he said quietly. The third man, who'd been silent until now, apparently decided that intimidation was the appropriate response. "Look, soldier boy, this doesn't involve you. Why don't you just sit down and finish your coffee before someone gets hurt?" The threat was clear, but it was also a mistake. Marcus had spent 20 years dealing with bullies who confused expensive suits with actual power, and he'd never developed patience for their tactics. "Actually, it does involve me," he replied, his voice carrying the flat, professional tone he'd used to address subordinates who were about to make career-ending mistakes. "These are friends of mine, and they're paying customers in a private business. You, on the other hand, appear to be harassing the owner and her patrons." Behind him, Marcus could hear Sirith moving, the subtle sounds of a trained warrior shifting into a defensive posture. He didn't turn to look, but he could sense her preparing to protect her daughter if the situation escalated. The first man apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. "Come on," he muttered to his companions. "We've made our position clear. The Property Development Committee will be in touch." They left with all the dignity they could muster, which wasn't much. Marcus waited until they were out of sight before returning to his seat, his enhanced vision tracking their movement through the window to ensure they weren't planning an immediate return. "Friend of yours?" Sirith asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Corporate representatives," Dolores answered before Marcus could respond. "They've been pressuring businesses in this area to upgrade their clientele in preparation for some big redevelopment project. Basically, they want to push out anyone who doesn't fit their vision of profitable demographics." Marcus felt a cold anger settling in his chest. He'd seen this pattern before on other planets, where economic pressure was used to accomplish what direct discrimination couldn't: drive out the undesirable populations, raise property values, and profit from the displacement of people who had nowhere else to go. How much pressure can they realistically apply? He asked. Dolores shrugged, but Marcus could see the worry in her eyes. Permit reviews, health inspections, zoning challenges. There are a lot of ways to make a small business owner's life difficult if you have the right connections in city government. Keth had been following the conversation with the intense focus of a child trying to understand adult problems that might affect her family's safety. Are those men going to make us leave? She asked in a small voice. No, Marcus said firmly. They're not. Cirith studied his face with the analytical gaze of a former military commander. You have a plan? It wasn't really a question. Marcus found himself thinking about the job posting on his tablet, about the contacts he'd maintained from his military service, about the network of veterans who understood the value of loyalty and mutual support. The security position I mentioned, he said slowly, it's not the only opportunity out there. Colonel Rodriguez has been building a comprehensive anti-trafficking operation for the orbital terminals. She needs people with diverse backgrounds and perspectives, not just humans with standard military training. He turned to Dolores, an idea beginning to form. How would you feel about catering some meals for a security training facility? The pay would be government contract rates, and it would give you some protection against local harassment. Dolores raised an eyebrow. What kind of protection? Federal contracts come with federal oversight. Local politicians tend to be more careful about harassing businesses that have connections to military operations. It was a calculated risk, but Marcus had seen similar arrangements work before. By creating legitimate business relationships with established security operations, civilian enterprises could gain a degree of protection against local corruption and intimidation. Cirith was nodding slowly as she followed his reasoning. A network of mutual support. You create economic relationships that provide benefits to all parties while offering protection against external pressure. Exactly. And it starts with getting you that job interview. Over the next hour, Marcus helped Cirith prepare for the application process, reviewing her military record and translating her experience into terms that would be familiar to human security operations. Her background was impressive. She commanded a squadron of 24 pilots, coordinated complex multi-species operations, and had experience with everything from crowd control to counterintelligence work. The challenge was presenting that experience in a way that emphasized her qualifications rather than her refugee status. Earth's job market was flooded with displaced veterans from dozens of different conflicts, and employers had become choosy about which applications they even bothered to review. Keth had fallen asleep curled against her mother's side, the exhaustion of recovery still claiming much of her energy. Marcus found himself watching the young dragon's peaceful expression and remembering his own childhood, before the war had taught him that safety was a luxury that could be taken away without warning. She trusts you, Cirith observed, following his gaze. That is not a small thing. Keth has learned to be cautious around strangers. Marcus thought about the implications of that statement, about a child who'd been forced to develop survival instincts before she'd even learned to fly properly. How old is she? 7 years. In our culture, she would be entering her first independence trials, learning to hunt and fly solo. Ciritha's voice carried harmonics of loss and regret. Instead, she has learned to hide in shadows and ration hunger. The injustice of it struck Marcus like a physical blow. 7 years old, and Keth had already experienced more hardship than most humans faced in their entire lives. She should have been playing with other children, learning about her cultural heritage, discovering her own strengths and interests. Instead, she was grateful for a bowl of synthetic protein broth and a safe place to sleep. That's going to change, Marcus said, and he meant it. Cirith looked at him with an expression that seemed to see straight through to his intentions. You speak with certainty, but change requires more than good intentions. It requires power and influence and resources that neither of us possesses. Maybe not as individuals, Marcus admitted, but I'm starting to think we don't have to work as individuals. He gestured around the diner, which was still busy with its usual mixture of working-class humans, refugees, and veterans. Look around. How many people in this room do you think have been where you are? How many have faced discrimination, economic pressure, bureaucratic harassment? Siritha's analytical mind began to follow his logic. A significant percentage, but common experience does not automatically translate to collective action. No, but it's a starting point. Marcus pulled up another file on his tablet, this one containing information he'd gathered about veteran support networks and refugee advocacy groups. There are organizations already working on these problems. They're just not coordinated, and they don't have enough resources to be effective on a large scale. The idea was ambitious, probably impossibly so. But Marcus had spent years watching individual families struggle against systemic problems that were too big for any one person to solve. Maybe it was time to try a different approach. "You're proposing to build a coalition," Sirith said, her military training evident in how quickly she grasped the strategic implications. Veterans, refugees, small business owners, anyone who's been marginalized by the current economic structure. "I'm proposing to help people help each other, starting with getting you that job, and helping Dolores protect her business, and making sure Keth has a safe place to grow up." It sounded naive when he said it out loud, like something an idealistic recruit might propose during a strategy briefing. But Marcus had seen enough of the galaxy to know that naive ideas sometimes worked, especially when they were backed by people who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Outside, the perpetual rain continued to fall, washing the city's grime into the drainage systems that carried it away to the ocean. Inside Murphy's diner, a human veteran, a dragon mother, and a diner owner began to plan the first steps of something that might grow into hope. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. 2 weeks later, Marcus stood in the observation deck of Orbital Terminal 7, watching the steady stream of freight haulers and passenger transports moving through the docking bays below. The terminal operated around the clock, a crucial link in the supply chain that kept Earth's 40 billion inhabitants fed, clothed, and minimally entertained. It was also a prime target for smugglers, terrorists, and anyone else who wanted to move contraband or people without attracting official attention. Sirith moved beside him with the fluid grace of someone who'd finally found her proper environment. The low-gravity sections of the orbital terminal were closer to the conditions her species had evolved for, and her confidence had returned along with her mobility. She wore the dark blue uniform of a terminal security consultant, complete with the insignia that marked her as a specialist in multi-species threat assessment. Transport 77 Alpha is requesting expedited clearance for a refugee manifest, she reported, consulting the data tablet that contained her shift assignments. Manifest shows 237 passengers, mixed species originating from the Kepler 438 system. Marcus nodded, pulling up the relevant files on his own display. The Kepler 438 system had been experiencing civil unrest for the past 6 months, with several of its habitable worlds declaring independence from the colonial administration. The predictable result had been economic sanctions, infrastructure breakdown, and a steady stream of refugees seeking sanctuary in more stable regions. "What's your assessment?" he asked, though he was already confident in Siritha's judgment. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd proven herself to be exceptionally good at distinguishing between legitimate refugees and potential security threats. "Passenger manifest is consistent with a family evacuation scenario," she replied, highlighting specific data points on her tablet. Age distribution shows significant numbers of juveniles and elderly individuals, which is typical for civilian displacement. Medical records indicate malnutrition and stress-related conditions, but no signs of military conditioning or combat injuries. Marcus reviewed the manifest himself, noting the details that supported Siritha's analysis. The transport was overcrowded beyond normal safety standards, another indicator that it was carrying desperate families rather than organized infiltrators. Military operatives generally avoided the chaotic conditions of refugee transports, preferring more controlled insertion methods. Approved for standard processing, he decided, but flag it for enhanced medical screening. Some of those kids are going to need immediate care. The terminal's medical facilities were already stretched thin, but Marcus had learned to work within the system's limitations. Dr. Sarah Kim, the head of medical services, was another veteran who understood the importance of triage and resource allocation. She'd find a way to provide necessary care without compromising the terminal's operational capacity. Marcus! Siritha's voice carried undertones of concern as she studied another incoming manifest. Transport 44 Bravo has a very different profile. Single adult passengers, predominantly male, minimal medical records, and they're requesting priority clearance. Marcus felt his combat instincts activate as he reviewed the suspect manifest. 28 passengers, all adults, all claiming political refugee status from the same planetary conflict. But their travel patterns and documentation raised red flags that his experience had taught him to recognize. Possible smuggling operation? He asked. Or worse, look at their declared cargo. Sirith highlighted a section of the manifest that listed cultural artifacts and personal belongings with no itemized inventory. For political refugees fleeing persecution, they seemed to have managed to bring an unusual amount of valuable property. Marcus was already activating the terminal's enhanced security protocols, alerting the inspection teams to conduct a thorough search of Transport 44 Bravo. His position as Security Coordination Supervisor gave him significant authority over terminal operations, a responsibility he took seriously. The past 2 weeks had been a revelation in many ways. Colonel Rodriguez had not only hired Sirith, but had also offered Marcus a civilian contractor position coordinating security operations across multiple orbital facilities. The pay was better than his disability pension, and the work gave him a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt since leaving the military. More importantly, it had provided him with the resources and connections to begin implementing the coalition idea he'd discussed with Sirith and Dolores. Veterans networks, refugee advocacy groups, and small business associations were slowly beginning to communicate and coordinate their efforts. It was still early, but the foundation was being built. Inspection team reports successful interdiction, Sirith announced, reading from her tactical display. 28 individuals in custody, along with 3 crates of illegal combat stimulants and 2 kilos of refined neurotropic compounds. Marcus nodded with satisfaction. Drug smuggling was a persistent problem in the post-war economy, particularly stimulants designed to enhance combat performance. Veterans struggling with psychological trauma were frequent targets for dealers who promised chemical solutions to problems that required comprehensive treatment. Good work, he said. Then, noticed Keth approaching from the terminal's education center, her small form moving carefully through the bustling crowd of workers and passengers. The young dragon had thrived in the past 2 weeks, her health improving dramatically with regular meals and proper nutrition. More importantly, she begun attending classes with other refugee children, finally getting the education that her circumstances had previously made impossible. Marcus, Mama. Keth's greeting carried the musical harmonics of excitement as she reached their observation post. I learned about human history today. Did you know that your species actually cooperated with other aliens during the trade wars? Marcus and Sirith exchanged amused glances. Keth had discovered an enthusiasm for learning that bordered on voracious, absorbing information about human culture, galactic history, and interspecies relations with the intensity of someone making up for lost time. I didn't know that, Marcus replied solemnly. In fact, your mother and I served in some of those cooperative operations. Really? Keth's eyes widened with awe. Teacher Martinez said that the Battle of Rigel Prime was one of the most important victories against the hegemony. Were you there? Siritha's expression grew solemn as she remembered that particular conflict. We were there, little star. It was not a glorious victory. Many good people died from many different species. Marcus could see that Keth was about to ask more questions about the war, so he smoothly redirected the conversation. "How are your other classes going? I heard you've been working with the engineering students." The distraction worked perfectly. Keth launched into an enthusiastic description of her introduction to starship maintenance procedures, complete with detailed explanations of anti-grav systems and atmospheric recycling that demonstrated both natural intelligence and excellent instruction. The educational programs on Orbital Terminal 7 were primarily designed to train technicians and support staff for the space-based industries, but they've been expanded to include refugee children who showed aptitude for technical subjects. Keth had immediately distinguished herself as someone with both the intelligence and the cultural background to excel in multi-species engineering disciplines. She has been accepted into the Accelerated Technical Program, Sirith added with obvious pride. Her instructors believe she has the potential to qualify for advanced training in starship design. Marcus felt a deep satisfaction at the news. Keth was getting the education she deserved in an environment where her species' natural advantages would be valued rather than seen as obstacles. It was the kind of positive outcome that made all their efforts feel worthwhile. Their conversation was interrupted by an alert from the terminal's communication system. Colonel Rodriguez's voice came through clearly, requesting Marcus and Sirith's immediate presence in the main conference room for what she described as a significant development. They found the conference room already occupied by several people Marcus recognized from his network-building efforts. Dr. Kim from Medical Services was there, along with Chief Engineer Park, Captain Williams from Transport Coordination, and, surprisingly, Dolores from Murphy's Diner. "Good. You're all here," Colonel Rodriguez began without preamble. "We've received some interesting intelligence from Earth-based operations that affects all of our security protocols." She activated the room's holographic display, showing a three-dimensional map of the local sector with various shipping routes highlighted in different colors. Marcus immediately noticed several patterns that suggested coordinated movement rather than routine commercial traffic. Intelligence analysis indicates that the corporate pressure campaign affecting businesses in the lower district isn't just local harassment, Rodriguez explained. It's part of a larger operation designed to destabilize refugee support networks and legitimate security operations. Marcus felt pieces clicking together in his mind. They're trying to eliminate the infrastructure that supports people like us. Exactly. By pressuring businesses that serve refugees, harassing veterans who might organize resistance, and corrupting local government officials, they're creating conditions for what essentially amounts to organized displacement. Dolores leaned forward in her chair, her expression grim. "I've been getting more pressure lately. Health inspections, permit reviews, anonymous complaints about noise violations. All since I started the catering contract with your operation." Dr. Kim nodded agreement. "Medical Services has been facing similar scrutiny. Questions about our budget allocation for refugee care, demand for detailed patient records, suggestions that we're exceeding our authorized scope of operations." Marcus could see the pattern clearly now. It was a classic destabilization campaign designed to eliminate potential centers of resistance by attacking their economic and social foundations. Military forces could be defeated through direct confrontation, but civilian populations were more vulnerable to economic warfare and bureaucratic harassment. "Who's behind it?" Sirith asked, her military training evident in how quickly she moved to tactical analysis. "That's still under investigation," Rodriguez admitted. "But preliminary intelligence suggests coordination between several major corporations that have significant investments in real estate development and private security contracts. They profit from displacement and instability." Captain Williams spoke up for the first time. "Transport Coordination has been tracking unusual patterns in civilian traffic. Large numbers of refugees are being rerouted away from terminals with comprehensive support services toward facilities with minimal infrastructure, forcing them into conditions where they're more vulnerable to exploitation," Marcus concluded. "Or elimination," Sirith added darkly. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just economic pressure or political maneuvering. It was a coordinated campaign designed to eliminate entire populations of displaced persons by removing their access to support networks and legitimate employment opportunities. Keth, who had been listening quietly from her position beside her mother, suddenly spoke up. "What are we going to do about it?" The question hung in the air, simple and direct. Everyone in the room had reached their current positions through individual efforts and personal connections, but the scope of the threat they were facing required collective action on a scale that none of them could achieve alone. "We're going to fight back," Marcus said, and was surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "But not the way they expect us to." He moved to the holographic display, calling up additional data layers that showed veteran population concentrations, refugee settlement patterns, and small business networks throughout the local sector. "They're using economic pressure and bureaucratic corruption because they assume we'll respond as individuals," he explained. "Single businesses trying to survive harassment, isolated families dealing with discrimination, veterans struggling alone with systems that don't support them. But we're not individuals anymore," Sirith said, understanding immediately. "We're a network." Rodriguez was nodding as she followed Marcus's reasoning. Economic warfare works against isolated targets, but it's much less effective against coordinated resistance. Over the next 2 hours, they developed what Marcus privately thought of as the most audacious plan of his military career. Using the connections they'd already established, they would create a formal coalition of veterans organizations, refugee advocacy groups, small businesses, and supportive government employees. The coalition would provide mutual economic support, shared intelligence, coordinated legal assistance, and, most importantly, a unified response to harassment and intimidation. Instead of allowing their enemies to pick off individual targets, they would present a united front that could defend itself through legitimate political and economic means. "The key," Marcus explained as they refined the details, "is that we're not trying to overthrow the system. We're trying to make it work the way it's supposed to work. Equal protection under law, fair economic opportunity, basic human decency." Dolores smiled grimly. "You make it sound almost reasonable." "It is reasonable," Dr. Kim interjected. "That's what makes it so dangerous to the people who profit from unreasonable systems." As the meeting concluded, Marcus found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a lonely veteran drinking coffee alone and trying to forget his military service. Now he was coordinating a resistance movement that spanned multiple worlds and involved dozens of different species. It had started with a simple decision to help a hungry child and her desperate mother. But sometimes Marcus was learning the smallest acts of compassion could grow into something much larger than anyone expected. Keth tugged at his sleeve as they prepared to leave the conference room. "Marcus, are we going to win?" He looked down at the young dragon, remembering her pale, starving form from 3 weeks earlier and contrasting it with the healthy, curious child she'd become. The transformation represented everything their coalition was fighting for: the right of refugees to build new lives, the responsibility of veterans to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, and the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. "Yes," he said with complete confidence, "we're going to win." Outside the orbital terminal's viewport, ships moved through the darkness of space, carrying cargo and passengers and the dreams of families seeking better lives. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new threats, but it would also bring new allies and new opportunities. The war for the future of refugee communities was just beginning, but Marcus was no longer fighting alone. 6 months had passed since Marcus first encountered Sirith and Keth in that rain-soaked alley, and the orbital conference room was now filled with representatives from 47 different organizations across 12 star systems. The Refugee Alliance Coalition had grown far beyond anything Marcus had originally envisioned, evolving into a political and economic force that corporate interests could no longer ignore. Marcus stood at the head of the conference table, reviewing the final preparations for what they were calling Operation Sanctuary. The plan was ambitious in scope and audacious in its implications. A coordinated response to the systematic displacement campaigns that had been targeting refugee communities throughout the local sector. Intelligence confirms that Meridian Corporate has accelerated their timeline, reported Captain Sarah Martinez, now serving as the coalition's Director of Information Operations. They're planning to implement forced relocations in 17 different settlements simultaneously, using emergency public health orders as justification. Sirith, who had been promoted to Deputy Director of Security Operations, highlighted relevant sections on the holographic display. Medical analysis indicates that the supposed health emergencies are artificially created through deliberate contamination of water supplies and strategic disruption of sanitation services. Marcus felt a cold anger settle in his chest as he reviewed the intelligence reports. The corporations had moved beyond economic pressure and bureaucratic harassment to direct sabotage designed to create humanitarian crises that would justify their displacement operations. It was biological warfare disguised as public health policy. They're manufacturing the conditions they claim to be solving, Dr. Kim observed from her position as head of the coalition's medical council. Classic false flag operations, but using disease vectors instead of military assets. Keth, now 8 years old and serving as a junior communications coordinator despite her age, looked up from her data tablet with obvious distress. But that means people will get sick. Real sick, not just pretend. The young dragon had grown significantly over the past months, both physically and intellectually. Her formal education had progressed at an accelerated pace, but more importantly, she developed the analytical skills and moral clarity that came from understanding injustice on a personal level. Yes, little star, Sirith replied gently. That is exactly what it means. These people are willing to cause real suffering to achieve their economic goals. Marcus had watched Keth grapple with this knowledge over the past weeks, and he'd been impressed by her ability to channel righteous anger into productive action. She'd become one of the coalition's most effective advocates, her youth and obvious sincerity making her a powerful spokesperson for refugee rights. So we stopped them, Keth said with the simple certainty that Marcus had come to associate with the best kind of moral courage. Yes, he agreed. We stopped them. The plan they developed was complex, multi-layered, and designed to exploit the corporation's dependence on legal legitimacy and public support. Operation Sanctuary would simultaneously expose the artificial nature of the health emergencies, provide direct medical assistance to affected communities, and create legal challenges that would tie up the displacement orders in court proceedings. Dolores, now managing a network of 43 restaurants and food service operations that provided employment for refugees and veterans, had coordinated the logistics for mobile medical units and emergency food distribution. Her operation had grown from a single diner to a major economic player in the lower district, providing both jobs and political influence. Food service teams are positioned and ready, she reported. We can provide nutritional support for up to 50,000 people for 30 days, assuming normal resource allocation. Colonel Rodriguez, who had taken a leave of absence from her official position to serve as the coalition's military coordinator, reviewed the security arrangements. Protective details are in place for all medical teams and supply convoys. Rules of engagement authorize defensive action only, but intelligence suggests that corporate security forces may attempt to interfere with humanitarian operations. Marcus nodded, appreciating the careful balance Rodriguez had achieved. The coalition's security forces were composed entirely of veterans with legitimate credentials and legal authority to provide protective services. Any attempt by corporate security to interfere with their operations would create legal complications that the corporations wanted to avoid. Legal team reports? He asked, turning to the coalition's newest addition. Attorney General Elizabeth Warren, the real one, not a namesake, had joined the coalition after retiring from her position in the federal government. Her presence had legitimized the organization in political circles and provided access to legal resources that individual refugee advocates could never have afforded. Federal injunctions are prepared and ready for filing, Warren reported with the crisp efficiency of someone who'd spent decades fighting similar battles. We have documentation proving the artificial nature of the health emergencies, testimony from medical professionals, and evidence of corporate coordination. The legal framework is solid. Marcus felt a deep satisfaction at how thoroughly they'd prepared for this operation. 6 months of careful planning, intelligence gathering, and coalition building had created an organization capable of responding to corporate malfeasance with professional competence and legal authority. Media coordination? He asked. Keth straightened in her chair, her role as communications coordinator having evolved to include media relations. Despite her age, she'd proven remarkably effective at explaining complex issues in terms that ordinary people could understand and support. Live coverage arranged with 17 independent news services, she reported with obvious pride. Real-time documentation of both the health emergencies and our response operations. Corporate media assets will have difficulty suppressing the story once it breaks simultaneously across multiple platforms. Marcus looked around the conference room, seeing the faces of people who'd transformed from desperate individuals into a coordinated resistance movement. Veterans who'd found new purpose in protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Refugees who'd gained the economic stability and political influence necessary to defend their communities. Small business owners who discovered that cooperation was more profitable than competition. Any final concerns or adjustments? He asked. The room was quiet for a moment as everyone reviewed their assignments one last time. Operation Sanctuary represented the culmination of everything they'd been working toward, but it also carried significant risks. Corporate interests wouldn't respond passively to this level of coordinated resistance, and the coalition's members could face legal, economic, and possibly physical retaliation. There is one thing, Sirith said, her tone carrying the formal harmonics she used for official business. I want to be clear about what we're really doing here. She activated the holographic display, showing a sector-wide map with refugee settlements, corporate holdings, and governmental jurisdictions clearly marked. 6 months ago, we began this effort to help individual families survive immediate crises, she continued. Today, we're implementing a comprehensive challenge to economic systems that depend on displacement and exploitation for their profitability. Marcus nodded, understanding the point she was making. We're not just providing humanitarian assistance anymore. We're directly confronting the power structures that create the need for humanitarian assistance in the first place. Exactly. Which means that after today, there will be no going back to individual solutions and small-scale interventions. We'll be committed to fundamental change, with all the consequences that implies. The room fell silent as everyone considered the implications. They'd moved far beyond the simple goal of helping refugees find food and shelter. They were challenging the basic assumptions of how power operated in the post-war galaxy, and that kind of challenge inevitably produced violent responses. I've been thinking about this, Ket said into the silence, her young voice carrying a gravity that made everyone pay attention. When Mama and I were starving in that alley, we thought our problem was just hunger, but hunger was just a symptom. The real problem was a system that treated people like Mama and me as disposable. She looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes with the direct gaze that had become her signature. If we just fix hunger without fixing the system, then tomorrow there will be other mothers and children starving in other alleys. And the day after that, there will be more. Marcus felt a profound respect for the young dragon's moral clarity. At 8 years old, she understood the structural nature of their challenge better than most adults he'd known. So we fix the system, he said simply. So we fix the system, Keth agreed. The vote to proceed with Operation Sanctuary was unanimous, though Marcus could see the determination and fear warring in everyone's expressions. They were about to take on enemies with vastly superior resources and political connections, using nothing but their own competence, legal authority, and moral conviction. 2 hours later, Marcus stood in the command center they'd established in a converted cargo bay, watching real-time reports from 17 different operations across 12 star systems. Medical teams were documenting contaminated water supplies. Food service operations were providing emergency nutrition to affected populations, and legal teams were filing injunctions to halt the forced relocations. First-wave injunctions have been granted, Attorney General Warren reported from her mobile legal command unit. Forced relocations are temporarily suspended pending full legal review. Medical teams confirm artificial contamination in 15 of 17 reported health emergencies. Dr. Kim added from her position coordinating the medical response. Evidence is being documented and transmitted to both legal teams and media outlets. Marcus monitored the reports with professional satisfaction, but his attention kept returning to a secondary display that showed corporate security response. Armed teams were moving toward several refugee settlements, apparently intending to continue with displacement operations despite the legal injunctions. Security alert. Colonel Rodriguez's voice came through the communications system with crisp military precision. Corporate security forces are attempting to bypass legal orders and continue with forced relocations. Defensive teams are moving to intercept. Marcus felt his combat instincts activate as he watched the tactical display. The coalition's security forces were better trained and more experienced than typical corporate guards, but they were also significantly outnumbered. The confrontations that were about to occur could easily escalate beyond defensive actions. All security teams, remember your rules of engagement, he broadcast over the tactical network. Defensive actions only. Document everything. Let them be the ones who choose escalation. The next 4 hours were the longest of Marcus's career. Reports came in from multiple conflict zones, most involving tense standoffs between coalition security forces and corporate teams trying to proceed with displacement operations. The presence of media coverage and legal observers kept most confrontations from escalating to violence, but several situations came dangerously close. The breakthrough came when Keth's media coordination efforts reached critical mass. 17 independent news services broadcasting simultaneous coverage of corporate malfeasance created an information cascade that corporate media assets couldn't suppress. Public opinion shifted dramatically as people saw clear evidence of artificial health emergencies and violent responses to humanitarian operations. Corporate security forces are withdrawing from all contested locations, Rodriguez reported as the tactical situation stabilized. Legal injunctions are holding, and public pressure is mounting for formal investigations into corporate misconduct. Marcus allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. The immediate crisis had been resolved without major violence. The displacement operations had been halted, and the artificial health emergencies were being addressed through proper medical intervention. But he knew this was only the first battle in what would be a much longer war. Preliminary casualty reports? He asked. 17 minor injuries among security personnel, mostly from crowd control situations, Dr. Kim replied. No serious injuries, no fatalities. Medical teams report significant improvement in conditions at affected settlements now that clean water and proper sanitation have been restored. The reports continued for another hour, but Marcus found his attention drawn to a personal communication from Siritha's position in the field. She was coordinating security operations at one of the largest refugee settlements, where over 3,000 displaced families have been threatened with forced relocation. Marcus, her voice came through his private channel, carrying harmonics of deep satisfaction. You should see this. The display showed a crowd of refugees, humans, Draconis, Zalari, and a dozen other species, working together to clean up their settlement and establish permanent infrastructure. Children who had been malnourished and frightened that morning were now playing games and attending impromptu educational activities organized by volunteer teachers. They're not just surviving anymore, Sirith continued. They're building something, a real community with hope for the future. Marcus watched the images with profound satisfaction. This was what they'd been fighting for: the right of displaced families to build new lives rather than simply endure temporary survival. The transformation from desperate refugees to confident community members represented everything the coalition stood for. "How's Keth handling the media attention?" he asked. "See for yourself," Sirith replied, switching the display to show the young dragon being interviewed by 3 different news services simultaneously. She was explaining the legal and ethical issues involved in forced displacement with the kind of clarity and moral conviction that made complex problems understandable to ordinary viewers. The corporations wanted to move these families because their land was valuable, Keth was saying to one reporter. But families are valuable too. You can't just throw people away because it's profitable. Marcus smiled, remembering the starving, frightened child he'd met 6 months earlier. The transformation was remarkable, but it also represented something larger: the power of stable communities to develop the talents and potential that desperation could never allow. Over the following weeks, Operation Sanctuary's success created momentum for broader changes. Congressional hearings were scheduled to investigate corporate displacement operations. New legislation was introduced to protect refugee communities from economic manipulation. Most importantly, the coalition's example inspired similar organizations throughout the galaxy. 3 months later, Marcus stood once again in Murphy's Diner, which had become the unofficial headquarters for the coalition's Earth operations. The restaurant had expanded to occupy 3 buildings, and Dolores had hired over 200 employees, most of them refugees and veterans who'd found stability through the organization's economic network. Sirith and Keth sat at their usual booth, but now they were joined by a dozen other families who'd found safety and opportunity through the coalition's efforts. The corner booth had become a community gathering place where children from multiple species learned about each other's cultures, while their parents discussed everything from job opportunities to local politics. "Any regrets?" Sirith asked as Marcus joined them for their weekly informal planning session. Marcus considered the question seriously. The past 9 months had been the most challenging and rewarding of his life, but they'd also fundamentally changed who he was and what he believed about his place in the galaxy. "No regrets," he said finally, "but I do think about what would have happened if I'd walked past that alley without stopping." Keth looked up from her homework, advanced physics problems that would have challenged most human graduate students, with a bright curiosity that had become her defining characteristic. "But you didn't walk past," she said with simple logic. "You stopped, and you helped, and everything changed because of that choice." Marcus nodded, thinking about the chain of decisions that had led from a simple act of compassion to a galaxy-wide movement for refugee rights and economic justice. It had started with one hungry child and her desperate mother, but it had grown into something that touched millions of lives. "That's the thing about humans," Sirith observed, her voice carrying the warm harmonics of deep affection. "When they decide to help, they don't do anything halfway." Outside the diner's windows, New Angeles continued its chaotic dance of commerce and survival, but the lower district had changed significantly over the past months. Where there had once been desperation and isolation, there was now cooperation and mutual support. Where there had once been exploitation and discrimination, there was now economic opportunity and political representation. It wasn't perfect. No human system ever was, but it was better. And more importantly, it was sustainable. The coalition had created structures and relationships that could continue to grow and adapt, providing protection and opportunity for future generations of displaced families. As Marcus watched Keth help a younger refugee child with her studies, he thought about the conversation that had started it all, when he'd heard Dragon's song carrying the universal plea of a mother trying to protect her child. He'd responded to that plea with nothing more than basic human decency and a willingness to get involved. Sometimes, he reflected, that was enough to change the galaxy. The rain had stopped falling outside, and for the first time in years, the sky over New Angeles was beginning to clear. Through the gaps in the perpetual cloud cover, Marcus could see stars, distant suns around which other families were building new lives, creating communities of hope in a universe that had learned to value compassion alongside profit. Keth looked up from her tutoring session and caught him staring out the window. "What are you thinking about, Marcus?" "The future," he replied honestly. "And how much better it's going to be." The young dragon smiled, her golden eyes bright with the confidence of someone who'd learned that the universe could be changed by people willing to work together for something larger than themselves. "Yes," she agreed. "It really is." Outside, the first stars were becoming visible through Earth's clearing atmosphere, and tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. But tonight, in Murphy's diner, a human veteran, a dragon mother, and her remarkable daughter sat with friends and family, planning the next steps in building a galaxy where no child would ever have to starve in an alley, while their parents sang songs of desperation to an uncaring universe. It was, Marcus thought, a pretty good start,